Like, I've literally had an AK kind of almost shoved up my nose by somebody, you know, theoretically on a friendly side, but who was just disgruntled, didn't like journalists. Don't like journalists, you're vultures. What are you doing here?
I'm David Knowles, and this is a bonus episode of Battle Lines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
On today's episode, we talk to senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant. This episode is an extended version of the chat we had last week in our episode of Battle Lines, where we talked about Roland's experience watching and thoughts on the new film Civil War. We really enjoyed talking to Roland about his experiences watching the film and about his experiences as a correspondent covering war, that we thought you'd like to hear our full conversation. Here it is. Roland, what does Civil War show to be the life of a war correspondent, and where do you think it gets it right and where do you think it gets it wrong?
Was an interesting question. It's difficult because I went to see it not really knowing what it was about, and I found myself watching a film about, you know, the job that I do. I was thought-provoked by it because a lot of it is very recognisable. Like, lots of little vignettes in there are very recognisable. There's the whole thing about, like, the kind of archetypal characters. There's the hard-bitten veteran war photographer. There's the young, enthusiastic freelancer who she takes under her wing. There's the grizzled, even older dude who's been doing it for years. I think the archetypal characters are true to life. A lot of it's true. I think one thing that got on my nose is the portrayal of the writers. They're meant to be with Reuters. And so there's a photographer and a writer, which is how we often work. Especially like in Ukraine, since the beginning of the war, it's generally writer, photographer. They're clearly friends, they clearly get on, they've clearly got a rapport, and that is how it works. But he always seemed to be drinking, which is not completely out of character. But it seemed like he was just kind of along for the ride in a way. It was quite strange. The way the situations they get into are very recognizable.
Like what?
Like all of it. Okay, so it starts off and they're in a hotel bar, which is like obviously a journalist's hotel. And they're talking about what their plan is for their next assignment, and they're trying to keep it close to their chest, and all the other hacks are getting drunk. That's true to life. Everyone's been in those kinds of hotels. Like, there's a press hotel, everyone gathers there, you exchange stories. Often you want to be there because your fellow journalists are kind of your best intelligence network. You know, people share information, they share security information. Like, it's just quite often that's where you want to be. So that's realistic. The way that they've got this bold plan for a story they want to do, they don't want to tell anyone about it, then their mate wheels it out of them, and then the other guy goes off and gets drunk, and then in the morning the photographer wakes up and suddenly there's this young freelancer in a car that she didn't know about. Because, I mean, those kinds of dynamics and screw-ups that can happen on the road, absolutely. And the whole way it's filmed about is 4 people in a car driving for a very long way through an environment where you don't really know what's going to be around the next corner. You kind of know what your mission is, and it's all about the dynamics in the car, dynamics between people, how you respond to stories that come up on the road and stuff like that. They run into really nasty situations with kind of gunmen who might be doing things you don't agree with, but you're powerless to intervene. They get shot at a few times, happens on the road. And the scene that really grabs people is the war crime scene with the mass grave, which you may have seen. I'm not giving it away. Everybody who's been doing this job has fallen into situations like that, where you're thinking, what the hell is going to happen now? Have I got on the wrong side of the guy with the gun? And things change. I'm not sure they would have got out of a few of those situations alive, to be absolutely honest. So that's what is right, and I recognise.
What doesn't ring so true?
I came out of that film a little bit annoyed, and I wasn't sure why, to be honest. Because as I said, like, a lot of it's recognisable. I think it's been made by someone who's got a lot of respect for war reporters, but I also felt like at the end of the day, it's made by someone who's never actually done the job, for a number of reasons. One of it is you get all these recognisable vignettes on this kind of road trip, and often the assignment is a bit like a road trip, but they're kind of disconnected. He's going on and on about kind of the stress of war and stuff like that, and there's a kind of PTSD subplot, which is all true, but one of the main stresses of being on assignment is filing, right, and meeting deadlines, and they never file. At no point, except the very beginning, she says, I'm going to go upstairs and finish my upload, right? At no point they talk about the deadline. Am I going to file this? Have you edited this down? Like, it's just Like the writer never gets out a laptop. So that for me is like the main thing that is always on your mind while you're doing this job. I also found the characters quite he's like picked archetypes to fit an idea of what a certain kind of classical war correspondent is. The Lee Millers, the Don McCullens, if you're talking photography. I mean, if we're talking about text, you'd probably be talking about people like Martha Gellhorn. Kind of archetypes and stereotypes. So although it's recognizable, I kind of felt like he was being a bit clunky with that. And the other thing was, it was a bit voyeuristic about the violence, I thought.
What do you mean?
Well, he's got this, like, Garland's got this way of playing with, like, sound. Everyone talks a lot about the sound design. And they'll be, like, in a gunfight and, I don't know, some pop tune will come on or something. Or there's a point where some guerrillas, they take some prisoners in a firefight and then they execute them. And he's got a big thing about the adrenaline rush of the job, I think, which is fair. A lot of us do the job, but there's part of that. And if you talk to any war correspondent who talks honestly about why they do the job, there is a thing about adrenaline and the adventure and the kind of the joy and feeling alive of being in those situations. But it's also, I think that can be overdone. Like, it's not really, it shouldn't really be a kind of voyeuristic thing. And you shouldn't be like kind of going, oh, that was amazing, that was a thrill, whatever. Although that, you know, you have that moment maybe when the adrenaline's coming down, you've got out of something and you laughed a lot of steam. I think maybe that's got something to do with Garland's own history. You see that interview with him where he said, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent and I went out when I was 19 to, I don't know, Southeast Asia or something. And he admitted he's putting himself in dangerous situations with this vague idea of being a freelancer, right? He's not the only person to do that at all. And like, I recognize a lot of my younger self in that, and that's fine. But I kind of feel like he's still, I don't know, like that fades as you get older, obviously. And it's a different kind of thing. So I think it's made by someone who's got a lot of respect for the profession, which is nice to see. It's not entirely unrealistic. And I think the depiction of what a civil war would look like in America is fine. But I think there's a part of me that would like to see a film about war correspondence that's like made by people who've done the job, if you see what I mean.
What would you want listeners to know about what doing that job is like, having seen that film and knowing that, as you said, like you get some of it dead on, and even the things you've been saying about like the journalist's hotel and like the hotel in Kiev where everybody stays. And the second time I was there, there's a lot fewer foreign correspondents there than the first time. You're like, oh yeah, of course, because interest is waning. So of course there's fewer people. Like even little things like that. Like
it's like interest comes and goes over the course of a war. So in the scenario in that film is like the war seems to have been going on for a couple of years. They've obviously been all the way through it. And it's reaching a crescendo, right? Because the rebels are basically outside Washington. And that's the MacGuffin, right? That's what drives it. They're trying to get to Washington to interview the president before he gets the Ceausescu treatment, which is absolutely believable. We'd have that peak of interest at that moment and that kind of dash to be in at the kill, as it were. But quite often, the interest wanes. These stresses, other things so I've talked about filing. That got up my nose. Not really being in contact with the desk, that kind of got on my nose. The cumulative effect of sleep deprivation and not enough food. A lot of people do drink a bit too much to just cope with the stress and move on.
Out of interest, were there silly moments? I mean, I'm thinking of like going across Kharkiv Oblast or wherever, and there's quite a few moments you're like, that's absurd. That's so silly. That shouldn't have happened. If you were in another situation, you'd laugh at that.
You make stupid blunders, right? So there was one time in Syria, we're all in Syria, like for the end of ISIS, and there's this huge battle going on. We're camped out with the SDF or whoever, and in this landscape just devastated for miles. Everything's been flattened by airstrikes and so on. And these guys drive down the road and in a technical, like a Toyota pickup truck with a machine gun on the back, and I've got a goat. And I thought, isn't that cute? I haven't seen a goat on a technical before. How absurd. So I photograph it. Next thing I know, guy's out of the vehicle, grabbed my phone. He's back in the vehicle and he's like, I'm going. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. I need my phone. I can't work without my phone. So there's a Mexican standoff. I'm like, stand in front of their car. You're not bloody going anywhere, whatever. And eventually he drives off, and then mine from the SDF has to go and negotiate and get my phone. Well, it turns out he'd stolen the goat. It was looting. I just photographed looting in action, basically, from the local population, which they were not meant to be doing. And I was so stupid, and and people were quite pissed off with me, to be honest. There was one guy, why did you do that? I was stupid. I just didn't know. So go. But yeah, you can find yourself getting into all kinds of trouble with random, dodgy situations. Things can flip very quickly from kind of quite okay to just like, whoa, terror in absurd ways as well, which I think the film kind of touches on.
The only sort of incredibly stupid moment that comes to mind for me would be driving down to Kramatorsk with this convoy of volunteers alongside all the completely flattened villages and the absence of people, because most people haven't returned there. There are minefields, but often they're not marked. So there's no sign saying this is a minefield. It just is, because so much of it is. And there was a rusting Russian tank with its turret blown off by the side of the road. So we stopped. The volunteers took a few pictures. I jumped out and stood on the asphalt and did a very quick to Mike that we're here in Donbass, in the rolling hills. Here's the evidence of the counter-offensive, whatever. And the car behind me was about 50 yards behind, and they'd got out next to a different tank, and one of the guys started walking out into the field to turn around with his for his amateur photography to take a better picture of the scene. And the next thing, the car raced past us on the way to them, and I could see it full of Ukrainian military chaps in fatigues and so on, raced past, shouting at the top of their lungs, "That's a minefield, that's a fucking minefield, what are you doing?" The guy obviously retraced his steps very, very swiftly, but obviously everybody was fine, nobody was hurt. But being shouted at by the Ukrainian armed forces for blundering into a minefield and one wrong step, and I'd have had to be calling London back saying, "Yeah, I didn't get to Kramatorsk because somebody in our..."
But this is actually an important point, and I actually, on reflection, and this is something I had to think about, I do like how the film has handled this aspect, and that is the aspect of experience and inexperience. So the dynamic between the veteran and the young enthusiastic freelancer. Veteran's a bit annoyed with this kid who is obviously putting themselves in danger and doesn't know what they're doing and is enthusiastic, but she recognises that was me 20 years ago. And the truth is, it was all of us. We've all been through that, and we've all made stupid mistakes like that we can look back on. And what I liked about the film was the kind of lack of judgment about it, which I think is the respectful thing to do, really, because at that kind of situation, like I haven't walked into a minefield. It's embarrassing things I probably don't want to go on now that I've done. Like, with experience, you wouldn't, like an experienced person wouldn't have walked off that road, right?
To be completely honest, I didn't, but I was on the point of, because I thought, it was probably fine. But
so everyone's done stuff that which they're like later were embarrassed about, which could have, if it had gone wrong, have gone down as very stupid. But it's kind of part of the process of learning, because what Alex Garland done is he's basically taken. It's like Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man, except he's got 4. He's got the 4 ages of foreign correspondence. He's got the enthusiastic young freelancer who just wants to do a job, who's got no mind, doesn't know what goes on. You've got the woman who's been doing it for years and is a bit jaded, but at the absolute peak of her game, and her sidekick. The treatment of writers, that's what annoys me most about this. It's all about photographers, aren't they great? But I love our photographers. But and then you've got the guy who works for what's left of the New York Times, who's like, he's right at the end of his career, but he can't give it up and all of that. And it's just, I can literally put myself in a car with all of those characters, basically. The problem with war reporting is that you very easily slip into cliches, because war is all wars are basically the same. I mean, every war is different, but war situations, what happens, very familiar. Julian Simmons, our photographer who I started this current war in Ukraine with, he's done like 20 wars or something. And as we were sitting in Kiev waiting for the invasion, wondering, is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? He was saying, well, I've got this template that I've developed over the course of my career, and I can tell now it's going to happen, because we've had this story, that story. Like, the players in this war are doing this and this, and it's all just ticking through the boxes, which was really valuable, actually, because he was such an experienced guy to be working with, and that really helped us manage in the chaos of those first few weeks. But yeah, absurdity and funny things. He's kind of got that in the film, right? There's this weird scene where they decide to climb from one car into another while they're speeding down the road for fun. Now, I've never done that, nor would I advocate it, but I don't know, things happen on the road where you look back and you think, that's a bit absurd.
What situations did you see in the film that you were like, no, what are you doing? Don't do that?
I mean, right at the beginning, where like the photographer comes downstairs in the morning to get in the car, crack of dawn, as they've agreed to go on this trip. And there's this inexperienced young freelancer already sitting in the back seat, like waving at her. Someone who she's already had to like get out of a dodgy situation, right, whatever. And she takes the writer aside, says like, what's going on? And he's like, oh, come on, it'll be all right. I'd be so angry if Julian did that, and he'd be angry with me, actually. It's just like, you've got to, if your teammate is kind of making these decisions about who's going to be in the car with you without telling you, it's not impossible that you'd have someone in the car. Maybe that could happen, but I thought that was a bit silly. What else didn't they do? They never do first aid on their casualties. That's another thing. 2 deaths of characters in the film, and at no point does someone get some pressure on that wound, whatever. Has anyone got a tourniquet? like all that stuff, which those guys doing that would be trained to do. Like we're all trained to do that. And we're not like expert field medics, but we're all kind of, it's drilled into us. We've all done the courses. So that was silly. In this final battle for Washington, which is brilliantly filmed, great action sequence, they're running around without helmets on. I was just in the middle of a firefight, like literally with the troops in the middle of the firefight. And the first thing is like, I don't know an army that would let journalists that close in. I mean, the Ukrainians certainly don't. Literally, like in the spearhead, you know, with the infantry, like first wave, and there's a photographer and a writer like running along. Maybe it does happen. I've never seen that. The other thing was like I was literally sitting there in the cinema thinking, why aren't they wearing helmets? I know it's because they need a full shot of the face for the film. It was the only explanation.
Were they wearing the journalist blue, or were they wearing?
I think they were. They were wearing journalist blue,
good.
So they looked very sexy and actiony enough, but no hat. Bit mad. There's this bit where the girl they pick up turns out to be shooting on like her dad's old like film roll camera, and they have like this conversation about how to do it. And I'm not a photographer, right? So like I would let Julian or Heathcliff or someone talk about how like, oh, well, actually you need a dark room and well, I've tried that on the road and that wouldn't work. Like I have no idea about that and whatever. But the point was,
who's that, Heathcliff or Julian?
Sorry, guys. It's an amalgam of them both. And they were like, she was developing her negatives, and then they're talking through like what made a good shot and stuff. And that might be an opportunity to actually look at what does make a good shot. What is a war photographer? So it's just like in the event, she just looks at it and goes, "That's a great shot. Well done. You're getting there," which is nice and encouraging. But the thing is, it's like modern photo. Like, how many rolls on one of those? It was like 24, 32 frames. Like you're shooting like crazy. You know, when I'm with the guys, you know, they've got their cameras out. They've usually got 2 or 3 cameras on them, like each of them fitted with a different lens so like you don't have to put on a telephoto when, you know, for things. And Julian will have like at least 2 on him, so you can respond to different things. I need this one for that, I need that one for that. But they're shooting digitally. They're taking loads and loads of frames, and then they can edit down, stuff like that. It's just, if this woman wants to be a freelance war reporter filing for the news, like she can't be doing it with that. I mean, people do go out with those things. Excellent photographer who's worked for the Telegraph a lot is Sam Tarling, who I worked with in Syria a while ago. He did a lot of stuff in the Middle East, and he was running around Syria with, I think it might have been his dad's old camera, but that was like for his, like, I'm doing a bit of arty stuff on the side. Like for the news stuff, you need to be able to shoot digitally, edit, file, because you've got to take so many frames.
So your film consultancy is open now. If other directors are looking to look at war reporting, they can come to you and you can tell them what it is, what it isn't.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because you end up having all these opinions. And the other thing is, of course, there's cultural differences in journalism, right? So it's by a British director, but it's a very American film in terms of its study of the kind of sanctity of journalism or something. Like, I do find the Americans have this culture where they really take it seriously and take themselves seriously in a way that I think does great credit to the profession and leads to very good stuff, but which a lot of the British journalists find a little bit holier than thou. And I think a lot of British journalists would say, I'm no less dedicated to the profession, but I don't go around saying, like, I'm here to bear witness. It's my calling, that's why I do it. So is it really why you do it? You do it because it's a massive privilege to observe history up close, and because it's exciting, and because, you know, do you want to be riding in a technical across the Syrian desert, or do you want to be getting on the Northern Line and, like, waiting 3 tubes until there's one you can fit on in the morning? You know, that's why people do it, really, you know.
One final question then. If there tragically was to be a civil war in America, one can imagine a place in which the press is seen as the enemy of one or both sides, given current tensions and current views and attitudes towards journalists in the United States. How is that explored in the film, and do you think that's true?
That is touched on, and I think the ambiguity with which it's touched on is quite effective, really. So they refer to how they say, oh, I want to go to Washington and interview the president who hasn't been seen for 2 years. And they say, well, they shoot journalists on site in Washington. Like, are you sure this is a good idea? And we all know there's been this a lot of kind of documenting about how people of an older generation talk about how once upon a time journalists were respected, and it was like no one touched the press, like they didn't touch the Red Cross. And then you got the wars in the Middle East, and you got especially ISIS, like journalists became targets, journalists were being kidnapped and beheaded. There's always been suspicion towards journalists whenever I've been working. I remember the early stages of the Ukraine war, we used to be able to cross the lines. You could be accredited to the Ukrainians and to the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. You could cross the lines, you could talk to either side, and slowly that clamped down until eventually I'm banned from the Donetsk People's Republic, for example, right? So that hostility is there. I think realistically, yes, people would be targeted. And the other thing is you're always looking for the professionals, right? For example, if we go way back to the annexation of Crimea, I quickly learnt the safest thing to do if you were dealing with the forces involved in the annexation was to make a beeline for the professional Russian soldiers, the guys in Russian uniform. Because the irregulars, they were just absolute thugs. And they were nasty. You didn't know what they were going to do. It was pretty terrifying. And several times in that situation, you're like, okay, where are the professionals? I'm not saying I would necessarily follow that tactic these days. Things have moved on. But there's always that balance and negotiation with who you're dealing with. You know, is this guy a nut job? Is he not? Does he hate me? Doesn't he? You would be asking questions about whether it's wiser to put press or TV on your car or not. Often it's not. Sometimes it is. Depends on the situation. Are you in a secure area with friendly forces? The way it's filmed in the film, he tries to leave it, and he raises all these questions like, why have California and Texas allied against Washington? How could California and Texas come together? I think if you watch the film, it's pretty obvious that they're the good guys, right? Because basically what's happened, it's all between the lines. Basically what's happened is California and Texas have set aside their ideological problems with each other. Texas has said, we don't mind the woke, and California's, we don't mind your redneckiness or whatever it is. And they've said, because we've got a fascist in the White House and fascism is the problem, right? And so all the way through, at the end, they're clearly embedded with these, whatever they're called, Western forces, these rebels, who are looking after the press, and the press have access, and they're being more sympathetic. So you'll say, if you know that Washington is where they kill press. But then I think the scene that grabs everybody, but I think really tells you about how dodgy it can be, is the scene where they come across soldiers filling in a mass grave, and 2 of them get kidnapped, get abducted, basically by the soldiers. You don't know if they're going to be killed by this guy who's obviously a psychopath and obviously off the leash in the way that happens in war zones. And the way they play that is all about, he's clearly like a racist, are you a real American, all this stuff. But every time you get hauled up by a guy with a gun who's seen press and he's like, maybe, what are you doing here? Like, I've literally had an AK kind of almost shoved up my nose by somebody, you know, theoretically on a friendly side, but who was just disgruntled, didn't like journalists. Don't like journalists, you're vultures. What are you doing here? You know, you're going to go home. So that there is both the kind of literally seeing them as targets and killing them, that probably would happen. And there's the general kind of distrust of journalists that can appear. And then there is a way in which you will find that if there is one side that happens to be more sympathetic or friendly or something, they might have more respect for journalists, and it'd be safer to operate with them.
Obviously, Battlelines is in no way in the business of movie criticism, Roland, but if we had to push you to give it a star rating and a recommendation to listeners to go and watch it or not, what would you say?
Oh, it's a solid 3. I mean, I might edge it up to 3.5 or 4, but I just had this feeling that this was, I don't know, maybe it's kind of like from the insiders kind of thing. I think it's thought-provoking. That's what I liked about it, is thought-provoking. There's an awful lot of stuff that it makes you ponder and makes you think about. It made me think about my job and how people perceive it and how I perceive it, things like that. That was worthwhile. So even if I came out a little bit annoyed, I would recommend it. I'd say go see it.
Roland Oliphant, thank you very much.
That's all for Battlelines this time. Please join us again next week for more of The Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye.
Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battlelines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.